There is a clay tablet no bigger than your hand. It was found on the coast of Syria in the ruins of a burned city sitting inside an oven. Someone had pressed the wet clay with a reed stylus, formed the words, addressed it to a king across the sea, and set it down to harden for the journey ahead. It never left the room. The city burned down around it, and the fire that destroyed everything else finished the baking, which is the only reason you can hold that letter today. Think about what that means. A message written by someone who assumed there would be a tomorrow, preserved by the exact disaster that erased it. The city was called Ugarit. In its final days, it was writing letters asking for help. But the truth is stranger than the legend. Because Ugarit was not unlucky. Ugarit was not an isolated tragedy, a single city that drew the short straw. Within roughly 50 years, nearly every great civilization from Greece to the edge of Mesopotamia stopped existing. Not declined, not reformed, stopped. 8 kingdoms, hundreds of cities, an entire connected world gone in about 2 generations. And here is the part that should unsettle you. Nobody has ever fully explained it. So what actually happened around 1200 BCE? Why did the most advanced, most interconnected, most sophisticated world the planet had ever built simply come apart? And why does the answer archaeologists are converging on sound so uncomfortably familiar? Start by forgetting what you think the ancient world was. You have probably imagined it as separate places. Egypt over here, doing Egyptian things. Greece over there, doing Greek things. Isolated kingdoms, occasional wars, mostly strangers. That is not the world of 1300 BCE at all. By then, the Eastern Mediterranean was running something closer to a system. Egypt under the New Kingdom. The Hittite Empire across what is now Turkey. The Mycenaeans in Greece, with their fortress palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Assyria and Babylon to the east. Cyprus, called Alashia, sitting in the middle as a copper warehouse. And the merchant cities of the Levantine coast, stitching all of it together. They knew each other. They wrote to each other constantly. In the diplomatic letters found at Amarna in Egypt, foreign kings address the pharaoh as their brother. They complain about late gifts. They negotiate royal marriages, argue about the quality of gold, send doctors and sculptors and healing statues back and forth between capitals. This is not a world of strangers. This is a world of colleagues. And the whole thing ran on one substance, bronze. It is in the name of the age for a reason. Bronze made the swords, the armor, the tools, the plows, the chisels that cut the stone blocks of every temple you have ever admired from that era. Bronze was the technology that made everything else possible. Here is the problem with bronze. You cannot make it in one place. Bronze is copper mixed with tin, and copper and tin do not occur together. Copper came mostly from Cyprus. Tin came from thousands of miles away, from mines in Central Asia and possibly from as far west as the Atlantic coast of Europe. Scholars still argue over exactly which sources were feeding the trade, and new isotope studies keep reopening the question. But the direction of the argument does not matter for the point. To arm a single soldier in the Bronze Age, you needed 2 metals from 2 ends of the known world to arrive in the same workshop. Do you see what that means? Every sword in every kingdom was proof that the network was still working. You do not have to imagine that network. You can look at it. In 1982, a Turkish sponge diver mentioned strange metal biscuits with ears on the seabed near Uluburun, off the southern coast of Turkey. Those biscuits were copper ingots. What followed, led by George Bass and Cemal Pulak of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, became one of the most extraordinary excavations in the history of archaeology. The ship went down in the late 14th century BCE. It was carrying around 10 tons of copper. Tin to alloy it, ingots of raw blue glass, ebony from Africa, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, terebinth resin in hundreds of jars, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber which had traveled overland from northern Europe to end up on a ship in the Mediterranean. One vessel, cargo from at least 10 different cultures. That is the world Ugarit's letter was written into, and now you understand what was at stake when it stopped. Now go inside one of those palaces, because how they worked is the key to how they fell. At Pylos in the southwest of Greece, Carl Blegan began excavating in 1939 and uncovered what he believed was the palace of Homer's king Nestor. Inside, he found thousands of small clay tablets covered in a script nobody could read. That script was Linear B. It stayed unreadable until 1952, when a young English architect named Michael Ventris cracked it and proved something that stunned the field. The language underneath was Greek. Greek 4 centuries before anyone thought Greek had been written down. And what did those Greek tablets say? Not poetry, not myth, not the deeds of heroes. Inventories, sheep counts, bronze allocations, rations of grain and figs issued to named work gangs, quantities of perfumed oil, lists of chariot wheels, sorted by condition. The tablets are administrative records, and they reveal that the Mycenaean palace was not really a royal residence. It was a distribution center. It collected, recorded, stored, and handed back out, which tells you exactly how fragile it was. If your entire economy funnels through one building and that building burns, the economy does not shrink. It vanishes, along with the only people who knew how to write. Here is the detail that gives archaeologists chills. Those Pylos tablets survived for the same reason Ugarit's letter survived. They were unbaked clay, and the fire that destroyed the palace hardened them into ceramic. Every one of those records is a fossil of the last accounting day before the end. And some of the final tablets appear to describe watchers posted along the coastline, units assigned to guard the shore. The interpretation is debated, and reasonable scholars read those tablets differently, but the image is hard to shake. Somebody was watching the sea, because something was coming across it. In Egypt, on the walls of Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu, there is a record of a battle fought around 1177 BCE against an enemy the Egyptians described as a confederation from the islands and the north. Modern historians call them the Sea Peoples. The Egyptian texts name groups like the Peliset, the Sherden, the Shekelesh, the Denian. Ramesses claimed victory. Egypt survived. Barely and never the same again. For a long time, that inscription was the answer to the whole mystery. Marauders came out of the sea and burned the Bronze Age down. Case closed. But look closely at what the Egyptians actually carved. Alongside the warships and the fighting, the reliefs show ox carts, women, children, household goods piled high. These are not only raiders, these are people moving, with everything they own, looking for somewhere to live. That single detail flips the entire story, because if the Sea Peoples were refugees as much as invaders, then they were not the cause of the collapse, they were already the result of it. Something had displaced them first. So what was it? Start with the sky. Sediment cores tell you what the weather was doing long before anyone wrote it down, because pollen preserved in mud layers records which plants were growing. David Kanievsky and colleagues studied cores from the Larnaca Salt Lake on Cyprus. Daphne Langut, Israel Finkelstein, and Thomas Litt analyzed pollen from the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea region. Both records point the same way. Around 1250 to 1100 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean got dry. Not one bad summer, a prolonged shift, lasting generations. Now read the letters again with that in mind. In the final decades, correspondence between these kingdoms is increasingly about grain. Shipments requested. Shipments delayed. An Egyptian inscription records grain sent to keep the land of Hatti alive. One Ugaritic letter treats a grain delivery as a matter of survival, not commerce. You are not reading diplomacy anymore. You are reading a famine in real time, in the words of the people inside it. There is more. Some researchers, notably the geophysicist Amos Nuer, have argued for an earthquake storm, a clustered sequence of major quakes along Mediterranean fault lines within a few decades. The idea remains genuinely contested, and destruction layers can be caused by many things. But several of these cities do show collapse damage consistent with seismic activity, layered underneath the burning. And then there is Hattusa, the Hittite capital, which is the strangest case of all. You would expect to find a sacked city. The excavator Jürgen Seeher found something else. The evidence suggests Hattusa was largely emptied before it burned. Valuables removed, archives thinned out, storage facilities already cleared. Nobody destroyed Hattusa, everybody left. This is what the historian Eric Klein has called a perfect storm, And it is where the modern understanding of the collapse has landed. Not one cause. Drought, famine, earthquakes, internal rebellion, migration and warfare, all arriving inside the same century, on a system that had no slack left in it. But underneath all of that sits the real killer, and it is not a disaster at all. It was the network. That beautiful, humming, hyperconnected world was also a chain of single points of failure. If tin stops arriving, you cannot make bronze. If you cannot make bronze, you cannot make weapons or plows. If the harvest fails and grain cannot be shipped, the palace cannot pay its workers. If the palace cannot pay its workers, the palace falls. And when the palace falls, the roads are no longer safe, so the ships stop coming. So the next kingdom down the line loses its supply too. Each kingdom's collapse became the next kingdom's cause of collapse. The very thing that made them strong is what made them fall together. Isolated societies fail alone. Connected ones fail in sequence, and the loss was staggering. In Greece, the palaces burned and were not rebuilt, population fell sharply, and writing itself disappeared. Linear B vanished so completely that Greece had no written language at all for roughly 400 years. Think about that, an entire literate civilization forgetting how to read. By the time the poems we call Homer's were composed, centuries later, the memory of the Bronze Age had blurred into legend. The heroes with their bronze weapons and their impossible fortresses were not fiction invented from nothing. They were the half-remembered rumor of an actual world, described by people who could see its ruined walls and had no idea who built them. That is what a collapse really looks like. Not just cities lost, the knowledge of the cities lost, but not everyone went down. Assyria contracted and survived. In northern Syria, at Carchemish, a Hittite royal line carried on for centuries after the empire that created it was gone. And the merchant cities of the Levantine coast, the ones we call Phoenician, did more than survive. They took over. Look at what the survivors had in common. None of them depended on a single enormous palace to hold everything together. And two technologies changed everything after. Iron replaced bronze, and the reason is the point of this entire story. Early iron was not obviously better than good bronze, but iron ore is common. It is almost everywhere. You do not need a supply line stretching across a continent to make an iron tool. The New World was built out of a material you could find at home. The second was the alphabet. Palace scripts like Linear B needed years of training and a scribal class to maintain them. The alphabetic writing that spread from those Phoenician coastal cities had a couple of dozen signs. A merchant could learn it. It did not need a palace. It traveled on ships, and the Greeks adopted it, and the Romans adapted that, and the letters on your screen right now are the descendants of that system. The writing you are reading is a survivor of the Bronze Age collapse. It exists in this form because it was simple enough to outlive the institutions that the old writing died with. Which brings this to you. Look at the device you are holding. Its chips were fabricated in one small cluster of facilities in East Asia. Its lithium came from South America. Its rare earth elements came from a handful of mines. Its assembly happened somewhere else entirely, and every component crossed multiple oceans to reach your hand. To hold that object is to prove the network is still working. You have already watched what happens when it stumbles. One blocked canal and global shipping ceases. One factory shut down and cars cannot be finished for a year. One shortage in one specialized supply chain and industries on the other side of the planet stop. None of that was a disaster. Those were inconveniences, and they still rippled everywhere. The Bronze Age world was not primitive. It was optimized. It was efficient, specialized, interdependent, and it worked brilliantly for centuries, right up until several stresses arrived at once, and it discovered it had no redundancy anywhere. Complexity is strength until it becomes exposure. That is the actual lesson buried under those burn layers, and it took archaeologists a century of digging to read it. So go back to the oven in Ugarit. There is a letter inside it. Someone wrote it by hand, addressed it to a king across the water, and set it down to harden overnight, because the ship would leave in the morning, and there was every reason to believe it would arrive. The clay is still there. The words are still legible. It is only the world that the letter was addressed to that is gone.